Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This amendment is very simple. It just strikes lines 11 through 22 on page 4, which is the AG portion of it. There's a private cause of action. We feel like that is sufficient to make sure that these constitutional rights are vindicated and validated in a court if you need that. So we're taking that off. The amendment is acceptable to the author. I move adoption.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Anchia, for what purpose?
Will the gentleman yield for questions?
Gentleman yield for questions.
Yes, I yield.
Gentleman yields.
And Representative, if I could continue on what we were just talking about. The seminal case, religious liberty case of Reynolds versus the U.S. from
Mr. Leach, the remarks must be confined to the, Mr. Krause, your remarks must be confined to the amendment before the body.
Oh, I apologize.
Mr. Krause, the bill as amended with your current amendment, how would it deal with the religious liberty situation that you were about to discuss?
That is a great question, Representative Anchia. We were talking about the Reynolds versus United States, the seminal religious liberty case from 1879. And in that case, it actually had to deal with Mormonism and polygamy. And what the courts came down and said is you cannot cloak criminal activity under the guise of religious activity or religious expression. So in the case we were discussing earlier and how this would now fit into this amendment were it to pass, we wouldn't even have to get there because that's obviously criminal activity. So that wouldn't even be the case here.
So the parameters here is that, your intent is that criminal activity would have needed to occur so that a religion would lose its tax-exempt status in order for it not to be considered support under your bill. Am I following that correctly?
I'm not saying that would have to under your fact pattern and scenario. We talked about criminal activity, so that would automatically negate anything we were discussing.
So let's say he wasn't convicted of that felony, right? But the rest of his story is true. He believes having sex with underage girls, marrying them without their consent, is supporting his religious organization, his church. Would that prevent the school district from denying him his job? Let's say there's no conviction. He just says, I believe it's important to have multiple wives. I believe it's important for my church, as he did in this case, to have sex with underage girls. What do you say to that?
Well, that's illegal. We've already known from the Supreme Court that you cannot commit illegal activities and cloak them under the doctrine of supporting religion. So it would not take effect here.
So illegality then is, in your view, the dividing line?
Well, illegality is one point. It's a very bright line that if you are engaged in illegal activity, then you cannot do that.
What about proselytizing? And I say this, we are taught in church to be fishers of men, right? And to go out and witness and proselytize. What about proselytizing your particular faith tradition in a work context? How does that work under your bill?
Are we still talking about the Jeff situation, or have we moved on to
No, just proselytizing about one's...
Members, if y'all could keep the conversation on the amendment before the body.
So the amendment, as it relates to the bill, impacts the parameters of the bill, right? Therefore, I'm asking the parameters of the bill with respect to proselytizing. A particular faith tradition, whatever it be, and we know that there are about 30,000 denominations of just Christianity alone. Right? What about proselytizing at work? Would you consider that offering support to your religious organization?
Well, I don't think that that situation is contemplated here in this bill because there's a lot of different laws, regulations, and rules on what you can say, what you can't say, either in the work context or others. So,
but that particular code section says, notwithstanding any other law. Okay, so you're saying, hey, if there are other laws out there, then we're notwithstanding them. We're putting those aside. This is the law. And so I want to understand what the parameters of your bill are. So we've already said, you already believe it is your intent that illegal activity out of bounds is proselytizing in bounds.
So the amendment is about taking the AG out and making sure there's still a private cause of action. For 5 years before getting into the legislature, I worked for a constitutional litigation firm, which is what we did. We defended individuals who had their constitutional rights, especially free speech and free exercise of religion. We represented them in court. And so oftentimes you got to look at the fact pattern and what's going on. But whether we have this law or not, you're free to proselytize at your place of employment.
So, and you would consider that proselytizing of any faith tradition to be considered other support under your bill?
Well, I think that anytime you want to tell people about what's most important to you and tell people what you believe in, yeah.
So yes, it would be covered under the penumbra of other support.
Regardless of Senate Bill 1978, you're going to be able to do that no matter what.
Okay. Okay. Now, I want to ask, you said earlier that, and I take you at your word, that the intent of this bill was not discrimination, right?
Absolutely.
So a justice of the peace who belonged to a religious organization that did not believe in interracial marriage, they could not refuse to marry someone under your bill, correct?
You're saying a justice of the peace?
Yeah, a justice of the peace who belongs to a religious organization that it believes in white supremacy and believes that interracial marriage is bad as part of their religion. They would not be able to discriminate under your bill, correct?
Well, I appreciate the hypotheticals. I think what we're looking
that's
at
what this is untested, uncharted territory. So
well,
we need to.
It's not, and that's the beauty of
this. If your bill opens the door to that, we need to know.
But all we
and clearly.
Here's what we do know.
Allow him to answer the question, Mr. Anchia.
Yeah.
We don't have to engage in hypotheticals because this bill is not solely focused, but it has to do exactly with the fact pattern we have in San Antonio right now. So if you are an organization or a company that gives to organizations that maybe the city council doesn't believe that it happens to be a religious organization, you are not going to be penalized for the government for that. We've had many different discussions, many different legislation dealing with the fact pattern you had. We're not dealing with that today. We're dealing with,
it worries me that you won't answer that very clear fact pattern, because that one should be easy. The harder ones come in about a minute.
No, I just don't want to get into this litany of hypotheticals because we don't need to. What we have in front of us is a concrete example of what this bill is trying to achieve. We want to make sure that if you give to the Salvation Army, you're not labeled as bigoted or discriminatory.
Well, let me ask you your intent then, because that may be easier, because I don't believe this is your intent. Is your intent to open the door to discrimination based on race?
No.
Okay. So that fact pattern dealt with discrimination based on race, and that's what we were trying to get at.
But we don't need to engage in those hypotheticals. Let's talk about. I would be interested to. I'm not going to ask you the question, but I would be interested to see if you think it's okay for the city of San Antonio to take an adverse action against a company because they donate either to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes or the Salvation Army. And that's really what we're dealing with here. And I don't think there's anybody in this chamber who says, you know what? If you give some money to the Salvation Army, you're a bigot or you're discriminatory. That's just not the way it works. This bill fits that exact fact pattern. That's what we need to be dealing with today. I get all the hypotheticals. There's plenty of time to talk about that. But what this bill does today is make sure that the government does not penalize you for your affiliation, association, donation, or support of a religious organization.
So I was hoping your answer would have been, hey, race is a protected class, and no, notwithstanding any law, we would not allow discrimination based on race. I thought that would have been equivocal. But what about the LGBT community that is not a protected class?
Can you repeat that? I'm hearing a lot of.
So I was hoping that you would have had a completely unequivocal answer for the first question, because race is a protected class. And by the way, the examples that you cited earlier about there never having been discrimination. I mean, this legislature has 10 findings of discrimination against it in the last decade alone on voting rights matters. But what about a non-protected class like the LGBT community?
Mr. Schaefer raises a point of order. The gentleman's time has expired. The point of order is well taken and sustained. Mr. Krause offers up an amendment. The amendment's acceptable. The author, is there anyone wishing to speak on, for, or against the amendment? Seeing no one, the amendment is adopted.